Today we can map out how the Monster Mind crew thinks. In case you haven't heard me ramble about this game before, Monster Mind is a logic puzzle Yiff game by Arganville, and it's really fucking good. Here's the E6 post ID, you know what to do. I'ma get around to redoing my Furry Filth episode on Monster Mind sometime soon, hopefully. But till then, here's a fun little thing. So, this chart here, what's going on? This chart is a thingy made by another YouTuber currently called Virginity. Link in the comments to that. And it's made to categorize how people think. It's based around two axes, which are lexical to impressionist and linear to lateral. Gotta mention, this is not a personality chart, it's just used to map out how a character thinks, which can probably have a hand in personality, but there's a lot more to it than that. That said, what does all this junk mean? To start from one end, lexical thinking means thinking in specifics. Clear-cut, unmistakable definitions. If you, as a lexical person, can't explain something, then you can't understand it. Abstract and experimental art, like vaporwave and non-figurative painting, for example, is gonna be a lot harder for a lexical person to understand, because it just doesn't translate into clear definitions. If you like to use rules, categorizations, such as this chart here, and or very precise notes to understand anything and everything, then you are likely a more lexical thinker. Down at the other end here, we got impressionistic thinking. Thinking in abstracts. The more impressionistic you are, the less you care about having everything explained the way that a very lexical person would like it to be. You might understand things better as just abstract ideas and feel like language in general is just not an accurate way to express your thoughts. Impressionistic people are usually more drawn towards stuff like art or physical activities as a way of self-expression, but it's certainly not impossible for a hardcore impressionist to find a way to communicate through words. Owl City is a singer who has no patience for making linguistical sense, and who just vomits out abstract emotions into his songs. Dreams Don't Turn to Dust is an awesome example of this, if you want to know what hyper-impressionistic writing looks like. The other axis down here is linear to lateral thought. This axis is a bit more simple if you feel intimidated by the other axis up here. Linear thought means thinking one thought at a time. You barely, if ever, go out on tangents. You barely, if ever, have multiple thoughts going on in your mind at the same time. And then the farther we move up towards lateral thinking, the more shit is going through your head at all times. The more tangled your thoughts are, the more laterally you think. You probably know hyperlateral thought by its more common name, autism. The upsides of lateral thinking is that you can way easier handle more complex ideas and very large amounts of data. The downside is that your mind is on methamphetamine at all times, so you're just gonna have a permanently higher stress level. Your mind is also gonna demand way more of your attention, leading you to feel more disconnected from reality, and you're probably gonna be more prone to overthinking because nothing can just be simple in your mind. Hyperlinear thought is the opposite. You're way more down to earth, you live 1 second at a time, but you're really gonna struggle to wrap your head around stuff with increasing complexity. And much like hyperlateral thinkers are going to be more prone to overthinking, hyperlexical thinkers are going to be more prone to underthinking, aka impulses. The super simplified version of all this is specific thinking, abstract thinking, simple thinking, complex thinking. I hope that gave you at least a basic idea of what it is y'all is looking at. The rest we can hopefully iron out as we go along. That's actually why I started this little series out with Monster Mind, cause it got some really good examples and the cast is small, so we can get this bitch out quickly and then y'all can ask questions in the comment section if you got any. Alright, let's get our mids sturdy. Alright, first up is the Treacle, who is monster lexical and pretty lateral. She loves being able to explain shit. She tries to explain everything not so much because she wants to force her own explanations onto others, but I think when you're this lexical, I think it's just the most natural way for her to communicate. She uses super clear and precise language, and she does accept that others think differently, and she tries to understand others by asking questions until she can zero in on how they think. Like, for example, during her little sexuality rant, she questions the player on how they define themselves and how that would change depending on circumstances. But when it comes to anything abstract, like some kind of abstract humor or sarcasm, it just goes straight over her head. You can actually bully her a little bit with this in the game by giving her really absurd answers whenever she tries to be flirty, and she just gets completely confused every time. But why on the lateral side? I dropped her in here because lateral people are generally more philosophical, more prone to questioning pre-established systems and trying to find better ways of thinking. And Treacle does question the modern way we categorize sexualities in one of her dialogue with Player Hand Dude, where she explains in extensive detail why she thinks this is a bad way of thinking, and she can also get lost in thought and forgets where you are in the game a couple of times, which is another good sign of a lateral person. None of these are to an extreme degree, which is why I'm not putting her in the super lateral category. And that is the Treacle. Now that we've had a hyper lexical character, why don't we move on to a hyper impressionistic character? And I'm fairly confident that Smeargle is supposed to be a character like this, and I do feel he has some impressionistic elements, but unlike Treacle, who I really think you nailed her. I think now that I've really gotten to look at Smeargle and focus on all this, I don't think he's that well expressed. And this actually makes a ton of sense because Arganville, the creator dude, is very, very likely a more lexical kind of person. Probably not as much as the Treacle, but I think you have to be a very lexical person in order to drag something like logic puzzles into furry porn. And so it makes perfect sense that Arganville would have an easier time writing a super lexical character than a super impressionistic character. But back to Smeargle. Smeargle has a few traits that hint at him being more impressionistic. He uses very unprecise language, for example, referring to certain sexual acts as naked stuff or poppy stuff. He uses words and phrases very anarchically, if that's a word. Like when he uses the phrase, toot my horn, wrong, and then the keg frog corrects him, and then Smeargle goes like, fuck you, I do what I want with that phrase. I think that's how an impressionistic person is more likely to use language actually. Instead of using the correct definitions, you just sort of discard the definitions and do with language whatever you want. We also know that Smeargle likes art, but that's really vague, right? I don't think we hear a lot about why he likes art or what art means to him, but I think this is really it. It is hinted that he thinks in a different way, and I believe it's impressionistically that he's supposed to think, but I don't think we get a lot of details on this. Would be nice to hear Smeargle go on some abstract tangents or talk about art or something like that. I'm dropping him here, because as I'm saying, he feels really impressionistic. I'd just like to see more detail on it. I like to see it better expressed. If it's hard for you to imagine what a very impressionistic person sounds like, open another YouTube tab and search Drawing Your Feelings, A Calm Guide to. Specifically the second one, and look for a video with a guy in a rainbow hoodie and a pad of post-it notes. That's a guy who's all the way up here in the really fun category, and he's a really good example of the abstract sort of expression that I would have loved to see in the Smeargle. And for the other axes, I think he's leaning towards linear, because I don't feel he has any super complex worldview or very complex ideas. He feels like a pretty moment-to-moment guy. but he can do a bit of at least somewhat complex thinking. He likes art, which I think you gotta be at least a little lateral in order to get into. If you're a very impressionistic person who's all the way down here, you're a lot more likely to be into sports or maybe simple video games or something like that. And there's a moment where Smeargle's boyfriend tries to get his attention by calling him a goofy cute name, and Smeargle recognizes what he's doing, and he points it out like, hey, I get what you're doing, you dinkster. You're trying to call me like a cute name just to get my attention. So he can see stuff from other people's perspectives and pick up on patterns. Right around the middle here, maybe a little. I feel like he's a bit more closer, a bit more down to earth rather than contemplative. But right around here, the most linear character, or rather characters, I could find in the game was Lucario and Best Girl Buizel. Both of them are very down-to-earth characters who have no need to make the world more complicated than it already is. Both struggle with logic puzzles more than the rest of the cast, since logic puzzles are just more fit for lateral characters, like the living room plant girl. Where Buizel and Lucario differ is on the other axis. Buizel often communicates with her own made-up little terms and phrases, or just straight up noises and expressions. She leans towards the impressionistic side, but she can and does still explain herself in fairly lexical ways from time to time, so she goes into the clear-sided box. Lucario's speaking is way more lexical, although she doesn't seem quite as obsessed with rules and definitions as someone like the Treacle. She just speaks her mind in a clear and simple way, which is why she goes into the level-headed category. Now for a lateral thinker. And for that, we can talk about the Hexagon. This guy has a pretty wide range of technical and economical knowledge. He understands how to take advantage of a bunch of shit to make a profit. And he knows a bunch of stuff about computers, which he himself considers easy. And to a lateral person, it might as well be, but if you gave a similar task to Buizel, then you're probably not as much. On the other paw, this dude seems to struggle with social situations, and this combined with his technical knowledge points at him being a lateral lexical kind of person. The more lateral you are, the more complex the entire world is in your head. And when it comes to something like coding, which is complex by nature, lateral thinking isn't a problem. In fact, being used to handle more information at once is an advantage. But the problem arises when something gets more difficult when you make it complex. Sleeping, for example, only gets more difficult the more you think about it, and social situations work much in the same way. To a linear thinker, it might not be very difficult. To a linear thinker, it might seem simple, but much of the stuff that comes automatically to a linear thinker might not come automatically to a very lateral thinker. And so they manually have to think about everything. And so to a very lateral person, simple things can become complicated and complicated things can become simple. This is what I see in the Hexagon dude. I think he's more lexical because of the way he speaks. The way he explains his thoughts is far closer to Lucario than it is to someone hyper-lexical like Treacle, or someone more impressionistic like Best Girl Buizel. Fairly precise communication. He seems like he has more of a technical understanding than an artistic or impressionistic understanding, and he seems like he spends a lot of time in his own mind. Therefore, I'm dropping him off here. He's certainly a bit of an unfortunate analyst. People all over this chart can be successful and unsuccessful. This hard-working Hexagon boy is just getting by in his own way. So that was an example of all the extremes. So now let's fill in the rest of the cast. The big rhino guy is going right over here. This guy speaks more in passion than he does in words. He's likely to express himself in pretty goofy ways, such as like having a conversation with his dick. He does that at a point throughout the game, but he can still explain himself lexically in a pinch. And a couple of times he indeed does. He isn't a super complex guy, although I do think his self-expression is a little more complex than someone like Best Girl Puzzles. So that's why I'm putting him a knock higher towards lateralness. Then we got Sandlash, I think he's called. He's the bimbo boy. I think he's very close to the center of all this. I think he's really middle of the road by both of these axes. My gut tells him he would have a little easier of a time understanding something very lexical than something very abstract. So we're leaning a little to the left. His puzzle rank is 26, I think. It's pretty solid compared to someone like Puzzle, for example. So I think he can definitely do a bit of lateral thinking. I don't think we ever see him like even close to getting lost in his thoughts. So I think we're also leaning a little bit towards linear, so somewhere around like here-ish. And then last we got Abra, and there's probably a bunch of you who are yelling at your screen to put for me to put her up in the human calculators category, which would make sense since she supposedly can solve the most difficult puzzles in a matter of seconds. But remember, Abra supposedly has around 600 IQ, so her puzzle ability is more likely tied to her raw processing power than it is tied to a super lateral thinking. Based on conversation with her in the game, she seems pretty lexical. No big surprise there. For example, in one of her dialogues, she gets caught up on correct grammar and talks with a player about correct phrasing of whether you're supposed to say no pair of underwear or 0 pair of underwear or something else. If you're impressionistic, you're pretty unlikely to give a shit about something like that. She barely, if ever, uses any abstract language, also, and etc. But the more interesting is this axis right here. If I gotta be fully honest, I think she's a little more linear than the Treacle. Certainly not hyper linear. She can go out on tangents and handle a bit of complex thinking, but most of the time, it doesn't sound like her thoughts get very complex. Maybe when she's talking about math or technical stuff, but when she's just rambling, she seems kind of simple and focused, more so than the Treacle at least. So I am putting her into the contemplative box. Boom, done. Hope y'all feel smarter now. If you got any questions or if you disagree with something, drop me a comment. Join Virginity, join Virgin Discord if you want. We're doing another movie night this Saturday at 16 CET in the event voice chat thingy. See you later. Eat your vegetables.